Sometimes owners have a huge year and they instantly decide, oh, I'm going to sell now. And that often makes buyers very suspicious and either not willing to consider buying the company, or they're going to discount it significantly, or they're actually going to go back and look at the prior years before the huge year they just had. I've seen several instances where owners of a trucking company wanted to sell, and based on their profitability levels and the multiple of profits that those kind of companies get in the market, their debt was actually greater than what the company was worth.
Dan Bishop, welcome back to the SiteShed podcast.
Great, thank you. Thanks for having me on. I'm happy to be here.
So, Cam, you are from Raincatcher.com, and this is the second part of the two-part series that we've recorded. The series title is Selling Smart, How Trade-Based Businesses Can Build and Sell a Profitable Business. In episode 1, we went through the 5 critical mistakes that can ruin your trade business sale, and those 5 key areas which we dive pretty deep into, with bad accounting, owner dependency, customer dependency, gross margin, and then vendor dependency. Go check that episode out, guys. It was very interesting. Cam gave some really interesting examples and insight into the specifics that he sees around business, why businesses fail in relation to selling their business. And we also touched on a very, very interesting dynamic in the space of preparing your business to sell and doing it with some structure, which sort of blurred the line into exit and transitioning planning and all that kind of stuff. And in this episode today, we're going to be talking about the art of timing, knowing when it's the right time to sell your company. So Cam, thank you once again. Much appreciate your time and expertise on this topic. Guys, to get access to Cam, all of his details and stuff are going to be over in the show notes. Just head across to thesiteshed.com if you're driving or whatever, and just search Cameron and it will pop up. And if you can't get hold of it, then just email through info@thesiteshed, but you shouldn't have a problem there. So Cam, the perfect exit, how the art of timing, basically. So when do we know the right time is to sell your company? I would like to think, in a perfect world, this would align with somebody's hopes, dreams, and aspirations and goals, but I'm sure the reality is far different.
It really is. And so the first part of my answer is probably going to be a surprise to you. So one of the things, business owners, by and large, eat, sleep, and breathe their company. It's their baby. Most of them have been working in it for many years. It's their source of socialization, of ego validation. It defines who they are. And because owning a company, and I have owned companies, so I understand this personally, and people who don't own companies mostly don't. Owning a business is a 24/7, 365 job. To one degree or another, it never stops. And it can be very exhausting. And because of that fact, many business owners don't really have much of a life outside of their company. Maybe with their family, because that would be their primary focus if they're not working. But many don't have hobbies. They don't have outside interests. They don't have strong social connections with friends. So the first place that you have to start in thinking about selling a company is to ask yourself the one question: what does my life look like once I sell my company? And I can't emphasize this enough, Matt, because I've seen it so many times that I can tell a number of tragic stories around it. Business owners finally think, oh, I'm going to sell my business. I'm going to get a ton of money and life's going to be great. And oftentimes they do get a ton of money. But they wake up the morning after that big check hits their bank account and they suddenly discover they actually don't have a purpose anymore because they didn't structure a life outside of their company. And many really, really struggle emotionally. And there's a lot of research that says a lot of these people regret that they actually sold their company. And more ironically, it's counterintuitive, but once they have all this money, they become extremely risk averse. So they can say, well, I built a very successful business. I'm under a non-compete, so I can't go start the same business, but I could go start another company. But they're extremely reticent to put any of those big gains they got at risk. So many flounder for a long time after that. The one famous kind of funny story is the guy who sold his company, and he said, I'm going to knock 10 strokes off my handicap. Well, for 3 solid months, he went out and played golf every single day. And you know what? He never knocked a stroke off his handicap. And he became so frustrated, it's a true story, just threw his clubs in the water and said, I'm done. So a lot of the visions that people get of what life's going to look like post-sale are kind of a fairy tale. So they really need to think through the personal side of this whole process. It's a very critical part of any decision to exit a business.
It's interesting you say that. I remember when I was in my early 20s and I went traveling as Australians do. They disappear for a few years normally. And the first point, my first stop was in a ski resort in British Columbia. And I was there for about 6 months and I didn't work at all. I just skied. And by the end of it, I was so over it. Like I had no purpose. I'd just get up and I'm like, God, what do I do today? Ski or snowboard? Like it was like the biggest decision in the world. I mean, in hindsight, that'd be a dream now. But I guess the point is, and this sort of tying back to the story about the golfer, you know, it probably almost became like a job to him, a job that he realised he probably didn't like doing all the time. He probably had more enjoyment out of doing it once a week with his mates than doing it every day.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Exactly right.
And it's also interesting. You see that same dynamic in the sporting arena quite frequently, where an individual's entire identity is surrounded by the sport, like, you know, a football player or a baseball player or a rugby league player or whatever it is. And then all of a sudden they get an injury or something and that prevents them from playing that sport again. And they just spiral into this state of depression because their entire, it's not the fact they can't play the game anymore. It's the fact that their entire identity is tied to it.
That's right. That is so true. And for a business owner, you know, all of the employees look to that owner for answers and information. So there's a lot of ego validation associated with that. So that's part of the kind of future thinking on transition process. As we touched on briefly in the first episode, you know, most business owners spend either all of their time or 95% plus of their time working in their company, and they don't work on their company. They don't really give any thought to what's going to happen at the end. Am I going to be able to exit this company? And a huge trend with Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, younger people today, they don't want to work at mom and dad's company. So that was a traditional way that generational wealth passed from generation to generation historically. But that leaves business owners with really only one alternative, and that is to put the company up for sale on the open market. And that means that they have to begin to think about running the company in a different way for value creation versus generating income and avoiding taxes and, you know, running some personal expenses through the company.
Yeah, it's a very interesting conversation, that whole succession planning. I did a podcast recently about that, and you know, perhaps, you know, a few generations back, like that was quite a motivating option in order to be able to pass that, you know, your business on to your children. But you certainly see it done badly in a lot of cases, probably more cases than not. I know one of my good friends, one of his mates, and I met him the other day, is part of a huge European company called Faber-Castell, who did the pencils. You probably know the pencils.
No, well, they make great pens. Yeah,
that's right. And my friend Rob was telling me how they've got a very, I mean, they're counts, right? Like they're actually in Germany, they're like counts or something. Like it's crazy. Like they're worshipped like as, you know, it's a pretty funny story. But anyway, essentially, as part of the succession planning for that business, if you want to work in the management of that business, there's these criteria that you've got to have accomplished outside of the business in order to earn the right to work within the business and, you know, carry that business on. And that business has been running for, you know, a couple 150 years or something. So it's pretty successful. But they've got to have set up their own business. They've got to have run that successfully. They've got to have exited it. There's all these different criteria they've got to establish in order for them to qualify to be able to work within the family business. And I thought that was very interesting because I think a lot of people kind of see that as their Hail Mary. It's like, well, I'm just going to handball it to the kids. And then, but the kids haven't been through the grind and they haven't been through the pain of starting the business. Right. And you see it all the time when second generations take over a business and they just cork it because they just don't really have that full concept of what it took to build that business.
Yeah. That is an extremely smart way to bring your children into a family business because the metrics, again, I cited some research earlier at first session on how many companies are sellable or unsellable, but the statistic for companies moving from the first generation to the second generation, only about 30% of those companies successfully transition from generation 1 to generation 2 in a family company. And even worse, only about 10% successfully transition to generation 3. So again, because of those kind of odds, more and more companies or owners choose to sell rather than run the risk of transitioning to the next generation.
So is this, in your opinion, the pitfall of the business owner trying to sell in the space of the fact that they haven't really planned accordingly? I mean, obviously, if you say to someone, I'm going to give you my business, son. The son's going to be like, okay, cool, let's do that.
Yeah, it's definitely, it's all about the planning and the fact that most owners just really don't think about what's going to happen next. What's their exit plan? I used to teach a course for the Small Business Administration at a local college here in Kansas City, and one of the classes, one session was solely devoted, they're all small business owners, and it was devoted to, so you created some kind of a business plan to start your company, but you also need to create a plan at that same time about how you're going to exit that company. At what point in time do you envision that occurring, and how do you envision that occurring? And just most of these owners don't do that. They don't think about what that means. Part of it is they don't really have an understanding of what they need to do, because some of those dynamics around packaging a company to be able to create value are very different from what they do day to day to run that company. It's a different kind of thinking.
It's a tricky concept to, I suppose, embrace when you're in the early stage of business as well. Like, your young business, like your focus. And I went through this exercise with like a business coaching program when I was just getting started in business. And, in the first month, they were telling us about mergers and acquisitions and exit strategies. And I was like, you know what? I just want to learn how to make my phone ring. And I think a lot of business owners, it's a scenario where you go in there and you read a book and then you go like, oh yeah, okay, I've read that book. And then, 6 months later or a year later, you read that book again and you're like, that was a completely different book. I just pulled so much, at the right time in the right place, this sort of, understanding, and I think a lot of people, when they get started in business, we have this conversation with business when we bring them in the agency. They're like, well, what's the immediate goal is we need to make the phone ring. I'm like, that's fine, but what does the forecast look like? Because that's what's important for us. Like, we need to design that roadmap. Otherwise, we're just playing for where we're currently at, which is not going to help anyone. So right. I'd love to hear some insight into that.
Yep. Yeah, that's very true. So they, most business owners, we see this all the time. They're focused on how much revenue can I generate and what kind of personal expenses can I run through the company legitimately. And if they're, at least in the United States, with a kind of a corporate structure called an LLC or an S corporation, we refer to that as a pass-through entity. So at the end of the year, whatever profits exist, they take that as additional income. So they focus on, how much of that income can they keep versus how can they reinvest in the business for value creation, which is not the same thing as how much of a distribution you take. Certainly, their EBITDA profits are quite critical, but that's still different from what they're taking out as a personal income.
So when we're talking about knowing when the right time is to sell, is this like a number-based KPI across different levels of the business that we're striving towards? Like, what actually are we talking about here?
So there are, I'm going to give you a longer answer to this one because it's not a simple answer. There are multiple factors. So certainly from a KPI standpoint or a financial performance standpoint, those are certainly critical factors. So buyers for a company are almost always going to look at a minimum of 3 years of financial history. And they want
Right.
to see a complete, detailed income statement with revenue, cost of goods, all of the individual expense line items. And they're going to want to see a consistent pattern in that. If they see a business in decline, that's not a good time to be selling a company. If they see a business with exponential growth year over year, it may or may not be a good time to sell, ironically, and that's partially dependent on the kind of industry they're in. So if it's a ultra high tech industry, that could be a really good time to sell in many cases. If it's a more traditional mainstream kind of business, it may or may not be the case. Sometimes owners have a huge year and they instantly decide, oh, I'm going to sell now. And that often makes buyers very suspicious and either not willing to consider buying the company, or they're going to discount it significantly, or they're actually going to go back and look at the prior years before the huge year they just had, and they're going to offer a bid based on the average of those 2 years prior to the huge run-up year. So it's not a simple answer from the financial standpoint. If the company has a tremendous amount of debt, that could be a problem at times. We see that in cases where, for example, heavy construction industries where they have to spend tons of money buying graders and plows and tractors and that sort of thing. I've seen several instances where owners of a trucking company wanted to sell, and based on their profitability levels and the multiple of profits that those kind of companies get in the market, their debt was actually greater than what the company was worth. So you have to look at things like what's going on the balance sheet, for example. You have to look at macroeconomic factors. Where we are in the recession. It's more difficult right now for any kind of a business that sells or is focused on the residential construction market because of concerns for recessions, the higher interest rates today. Those make it difficult to sell. If we were 3 or 4 years ago when interest rates were zero, those could have been opportune times to perhaps sell that kind of a company. So there are a whole variety of factors, but in general, you want a business that has had consistent gross profit margins and consistent EBITDA profit levels and margins, and has not been in decline. Most buyers don't want to look at a company that is just 2 or 3 or 4 years old. They want minimum of like 5 years of history. So there's a lot of criteria that come into play on what makes a company ready at the right time to sell.
So I guess like those things are relevant to people that are wanting to buy a business. But if we're talking about when we need to know what the right time is to sell our business, like, yes, okay, sure, we need to have financial history. So we need to make sure that we have nice clean books at least 3 years in advance that are, ideally showcasing growth. But like that's not really an indicator of when to sell. Like, is it like how do we, I guess what I'm trying to forecast and visualize here is like, how do we know when the right time to sell our business is? Like, how do you define those metrics, and what, like, or better, let me put it a different way. In some of the successful transactions that you've seen over the years, what are the metrics that those businesses have had in place, knowing that it's the right time for them to sell?
Right. Well, I'm going to get two-part answers. So the first part of that, again, is personal. When somebody calls us and says, I want to sell my company, the very first, we don't ask them what their industry is, what their financials are. We ask them why you want to sell.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the number one litmus test right there. It's a very personal thing. So As an example, before COVID, the typical answer to that question was, well, I want to play more golf. I want to I want to spend time with my grandkids. I want to travel. My spouse has been ill. I want to spend more time with him or her. Post COVID, the answers changed a lot. We still do get those answers, but uh, so many business owners got really worn out through COVID with the challenges around, do you have people wear masks or not wear masks? Do you have people get COVID shots or not get COVID shots? And half your employees are unhappy with either choice you made. And we hit huge supply chain issues coupled with massive run-ups in pricing, and it exhausted a lot of owners. And a lot of these are baby boomer owners, and they had to survive through the huge recession in 2007, 8, and 9. A lot of them are just tired. And couple that with the dynamic that today they can't find employees. Every industry we talk to, doesn't matter, when they say, I can't hire people. If I find somebody to hire, I hire them and they don't show up. They show up for a week, then they don't show up. I could be growing my business 10%, 20%, maybe more if I could find people to hire. And a lot of them have just gotten tired. So their number one driver on when it was time to sell, they don't want to do it anymore. It's a very personal thing. They want to make a lifestyle change.
How many times have you ever heard somebody say to you, I know it's the right time to sell because on my strategic forecast 10 years ago, I identified that if I hit this number and we did this, we could achieve this, then we would exit?
Unfortunately, I got to be honest here. I don't think I've heard that because 98% of the business owners that I talk to, most of them don't even do a budget, much less have a strategic plan of a year, much less 10 years in the process. But the other factors are relative to their industry and what the particular dynamics happen to be in their marketplace. Those are other key criteria that they often use to make a decision.
So in your experience, most of these conversations have a reactive undertow?
They definitely have an emotional and reactive undertow that are very much lifestyle driven and correlated with they're just tired or they're burnout. One of my clients right now, he built an amazing company, started as a master plumber, which is a licensing designation in the United States, and built a $50 million company. But that's not where his lifestyle values are. He's a big hunter, has a ranch, and he just says, hey, I don't want to work 60, 70, 80, 90 hours a week anymore. I want to sell my company. He's a very smart, very humble guy. He's not greedy. He knows he can sell his company for enough that he can live comfortably for the rest of his life, help transition his business, take care of his employees. But he doesn't want to do that like that anymore. And we see a fair amount of that.
So what are some of the things, I suppose, then in maybe a better conversation would be how to not be in a situation where it is reactive and emotional. Like, how do you prepare, in your experience, a business for potential exit today, knowing in 10 years' time, maybe I'll want to sell it?
Yeah. I think it's about asking some hard questions of yourself. And most business owners are married and have a spouse. That's a pretty significant conversation. I often and many times have met with the spouse of these owners to make sure they're on board and they're fully supportive and they understand the overall objective of the process, because selling is a very emotional thing overall. It's a roller coaster ride during the actual process. So they really need to step back and take a look at life and say, what do I want out of life? How much longer do I want to work? And what's my end game? What's my exit plan? if they've got kids, that's maybe a tough conversation with the kids. Do they want to be in the business? Then there are experts can help how to figure out how to transition the kids into the business. If they don't, then the question becomes, what am I going to do with the business, and when do I want to finish or quit or sell? Could be 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. The answer is solely dependent on the individual.
What about financial security and legacy?
I don't think I've come across a business owner yet. I've heard stories of this, but again, I've been doing this for, one way or another for more years than I care to think about, who didn't care about their legacy and care about their employees in the company. And that's always a factor. When we're looking for buyers for business, we look at the overall price the buyer offers to the company, what the terms they're offering, what the deal structure looks like, but we also look at buyer fit. I jokingly refer to it as 50% of my job as being an investment banker, dealing with dollars and numbers and percentages and hardcore negotiations. And the other 50% is acting like I am Match.com to find the right buyer for my client, because they want to know that somebody, obviously they want to make good money, but they also want to know that somebody's going to take care of their baby and take care of their employees, because they have a lot of loyalty for their employees in that process.
I had someone on the show a few weeks back who was talking about an acquisition where it didn't go to the highest bidder because of that exact reason. It went to someone that was the second highest bidder, but they were a better fit. They had a better supporting business in the interest of the legacy of that business carrying on.
Yeah.
And I was surprised by that, because I sort of immediately would think, well, especially if you're using somebody who's going to be getting a percentage of sale, for example, as part of as a commission structure, would be just jonesing for the highest number, right? But
Yeah.
It's good to hear that's not the case.
Yeah, I mentioned I was selling a really fascinating company, husband and wife owned, right now, that represents European manufacturers of ultra high-end windows and doors that go into Aspen, Colorado, $5 million, $75 million kind of houses.
Wow.
And they literally, as we're doing this podcast, Matt, are meeting with one of the buyers that submitted a letter of intent for the company. The letter of intent is competitive from a pricing standpoint, but they're meeting with every one of the interested buyers in person to sit down with them and see if their personality style, their cultural values, their vision for the company are aligned with their vision. This is a very cool couple. Gotten to know them quite well and really think highly of them. And I'm not sure if they'll pick the highest bidder or not. But I mentioned earlier on our podcast here that about 3 months or so ago, I sold a $25 million mining and construction company in Arizona. And we brought 5 offers in for that company. And it's my job as an investment banker to understand what my client wants, what his or her priorities are, and achieve that goal. And in that particular case, that client picked the lowest of 5 offers because he wanted to continue to work, and his vision, values, cultural structure and everything were fully aligned with that business. That wouldn't have been my choice. We had offers that were $2 to $4 million higher than the bid he took. But that's not my job. My job is to get him what he needs that meets his requirements. And it's not my question or my job to say, I don't agree with you, because that's what was right for him. I stay in touch with him. He's very happy. It worked as he had anticipated that it would work out for him. So, yeah, we do see those kind of things on a regular basis. He said, hey, look, Cam, I want to make a ton of money here. How much more money do I really need? I want this and this and this. All of his employees, there was a much bigger company that bought his company. They were going to get hourly pay raises. They were going to get benefit package that was way better than what he could offer them. The company was going to invest in them. They were going to grow. There was going to be promotional opportunities for them. And he looked at all of that in the aggregate to make his decisions.
So it sounds to me like the right time for a business to sell is really in line with the business owner's like life plan and goals.
Yeah, very much so.
More so than the business itself.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, definitely they're intertwined, but it has to start with what that owner's view of his or her life is on a longer term basis. And as I think you said earlier, Matt, it is the single greatest source of potential generational wealth for these owners. That's where most of their life value, because they've reinvested in their company over these years versus diversify out of it because it's their baby. And that's, it's their income. It's all the other things we've talked about.
What about scenarios where you've got like partnerships, for example, where you enter into a business, and partnerships are disaster ships. This whole conversation, but like I know one of the ways that a lot of people sort of advise when you enter into any sort of partnership arrangement is to have a clearly defined exit for both parties normally in a line with KPI based performances. Like if we get to this stage or whatever, we either sell to the other one or we sell the business or whatever it might be.
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of those could go very well and smoothly. Some of them could go really, really, really bad.
You would know more than me, but is in your experience the ones that do go bad as a result typically of not having those things in place from the onset?
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, most business owners, when they start a business, two individuals say, "Hey, let's go to work together and start this company."
Yeah. We're
The
mates.
number one mistake, the number one mistake they make is that they go into it as 50-50 partners.
Right.
So they are total legal equals, and no one can ultimately call the shots. And I know a scenario here in my market in Kansas City where that was the case. And the two owners got into such heated arguments, hired lawyers, they literally destroyed their own company because they couldn't agree on how to sell the company or what the company was worth. If they have in the U.S., we call it, it's a legal agreement called a buy-sell agreement. And it creates a structure it creates a formula and a structure. If one owner says, "Hey, I'm tired of this, I want to get out," it creates a way for the other owner to buy out his or her partner in the business that is very well documented and laid out, and most often avoids a lot of these fractious issues that come up if the two owners don't see eye to eye on something.
I mean, that'll never happen though, Cam, because we're mates. Like we wouldn't do that.
Yeah, that's what they say when they go into it. That's for sure. It's funny how life changes things and how money can change things.
Absolutely. I've seen this just so many times. I mean, you would have seen it so many more without question because this is your space. But like I even one of the young girls I trained with, she's in the like exercise physiology sort of space, and she went into business with a friend of hers. And I just said to her from the beginning, I said, girls, I know you guys are best friends. They're best friends, and they still are, thankfully. But so just make sure you have this drawn up legally so you understand, like, this gives you guys both an out that isn't going to kill your friendship and so on and so forth. Those things are not obvious. Like that's something that most people probably learn through School of Hard Knocks.
That's right. Yeah. One real quick interesting story of a business that did it wisely. It was a fascinating business. It was in the financial services sector. There were three owners. Each of them owned 33 1/3% of the business. One of the owners was age-wise was in his 40s. One was in his 50s. And the third partner was in his early 60s. And this company was printing money. I still can't believe how much money these guys were making. But because they were all at a different age point in their lives and their careers, they realized that they needed to do something. And this is back when I was a partner in the consulting firm. So one of my other partners and I went in. This was a very complex deal, but we created a structure for them because the younger guys wanted to invest into the business because they knew they could grow it exponentially. But the guy in his early 60s knew that he wasn't going to be involved in the business, or who knows, maybe even alive long enough to really realize the return on the investments that the younger guys wanted to make in the company. But to make those investments, they were all going to have to take less income in the form of their annual profit distribution in order to do that. So we came up with a very complex structure that saved their whole company and their relationships with each other, that allowed particularly the older partner to be able to realize returns. And we set up a value creation formula for them to be able to all be happy and continue to work and build a company together that was aligned with each of their age group and their personal objectives. But most companies aren't smart enough to do that, and that's what creates real controversy.
Yeah, I bet that was like a twitch in the eye when you were like, oh, look, there's three of us and we're all 33.3% partners. Were you like, oh, God, here we go again?
Yeah, it was kind of a first, whoa, I don't know how we're going to deal with this one. But we got through it, and everybody looked as far as I know, haven't talked to them in a few years, but it looked like everybody ended happily ever after.
Oh, so it did work out? It
That's
did work out, didn't it? Yeah. Yeah, so I know I can think of one book that was quite good. I actually had the author on the podcast a couple of years ago, John Warrilow, who wrote Built to Sell. Are you familiar with that book?
I'm not, sorry.
Okay. It was interesting because that sort of goes through some of the frameworks in a line with, the things you need to consider to sell a business. I suppose I guess it's kind of tricky to understand exactly when someone needs to, when the right time is, because like you say, it's very circumstantial. I suppose my takeaway from this is understand what that looks like personally. And I think as well, a lot of the, it sort of comes down to that whole strategic conversation and spending the time within the strategy of the business, spending time on the business, not in the business, like understanding, like doing the goals and doing the strategy and really like identifying what that macro picture looks like. I think most business owners, in my experience, don't take the time to do that often enough, probably myself included.
Yeah, I worked with a guy who did a lot of presentations, and one of the things he said is that there are 5 Ds that are the key drivers for why businesses get sold. One is death, one is disability, one is distress, personal or family, one is disagreement, and the last one is divorce. Right. Those are often critical drivers in why companies are put up for sale. The 5 Ds.
Interesting. Well, mate, thank you very much for your time. I think we can pretty much wrap this one up unless there's anything you think we haven't covered.
We've covered a lot of territory that I truly hope will be helpful for business owners. Again, to avoid some of the things that I see often on a daily basis, and maybe some days I won't feel so bad if I have to I have to be honest with people, and if I have to tell them that there's huge problems with their company or they're not sellable right now, it's really kind of heartbreaking oftentimes. So that's part of my mission, is to help educate people to maybe get ahead of that and avoid that kind of a situation.
Well, no, I appreciate your wisdom on that, on this topic, because I think truthfully, a lot of people, like a lot of these things are not obvious, so I think it's super useful that you've been able to come and share that with us, and thank you so much for your time. Cameron Bishop, you are from Raincatcher.com. Guys, I've got links to Cam's website, to his LinkedIn, to his email, all that kind of stuff within the show notes. So head across to the siteshed.com and search Cameron, and you'll find this episode and the previous episode that we recorded as part of this small 2-part mini-series titled How Tradies Can Sell a Profitable Business. Cam, thank you so much. I'll let you get on with your day. I know it's getting on over there. But yeah, once again, thank you so much for your time.
Cheers, Matt. Happy to be here. Thank you so much.
listeners and viewers, if you have any questions or anything we haven't covered off on, as always, let me know. I'm sure I could rubber arm Cam into coming back on the show and answering some of those if there's anything specific you want an answer there. Otherwise, that is a wrap. Hey guys and girls, how would you like all of the value adds left behind from our podcast guest all put together in the one spot? We've pulled every tool together, every template, every resource shared on the show, and we've packed them all into the Tradie Academy. It's free to join and it's built by the team behind the site Shed and Tradie Web guys. Inside, you'll get marketing tips, business tools, and first access to future resources, all in one simple dashboard. Just head across to tradie.wiki/pod. That's tradie.wiki/pod. The link's in the episode description. And once again, you just log in once and then you're all set. And if you want to get notified of upcoming episodes, hit subscribe or follow.